and welcome to this Design Cuts video tutorial. Today we're looking at demystifying the mixer brush in Photoshop. As always, in this video I'll be using some Design Cuts assets. I'll be using an illustration from 550 plus hand-drawn illustrations by Zeppelin Graphics. Now there are a whole series of illustrative elements that you can use in this collection. Some of them are shapes, but I'm using an image which is delivered as a ping image. I'll also be using a photo from this collection. It's 100 high-res photos by Moonloop, and these photos are just awesome. I absolutely love these photos, so I'm going to be using one of those photos. So let's swing back to Photoshop. The mixer brush first appeared in Photoshop CS5, but you may find that in later versions of Photoshop, when you open up the brushes flyout here, that the mixer brush tool doesn't even exist there. If that's the case, you're going to need to begin by putting the mixer brush back where it belongs. Choose Edit and then Toolbar. If your mixer brush isn't here with the other brushes, then it's going to be over here in the extra tools. Drag down here to locate the brushes group here and drag the mixer brush, which will be here, over and drop it in here so then it belongs with the tools that it relates to, and click Done. I don't need to do that, my mixer brush is already installed. Now it can be very confusing as to exactly what you can use the mixer brush with. This is the mixer brush options that are visible right now because I have a mixer brush selected. But I'm going to open this brush flyout panel. I'm going to choose a different brush. And you can see that the tool options changed immediately because the brush that I'm using right now isn't actually set up for the mixer brush. We can do it, but not this way. So when you're looking at your current brushes panel, you're going to be looking for a brush that has a little drop above it, and that's a mixer brush. This is not a mixer brush. That's a different one entirely. It uses the smudge tool, not the mixer brush. So to start off with, make sure that you locate a brush that is actually a mixer brush. Now you'll find some additional mixer brushes if you install the converted legacy tool presets and the legacy brushes. You do that from the flyout menu here. Choose converted legacy tool presets, install those, and also install legacy brushes. For the legacy tool presets, they all have the little mixer brush icon telling you which ones are preset for the mixer brush. With the legacy tools themselves, they don't have that little icon, but you can still select them. And if you have a look up here, if you still see the mixer brush options, then you're on a mixer brush. But if you want to use the converted presets, then just click on one here and you'll get the converted presets. Now this one's a bristle brush, so it has this little indicator in here. If they're not bristle brushes, they won't have that, but they'll still show up and work as brushes. Now the tool presets for the mixer brush are really critical to understand. The first one here just opens the brush settings panel, so you can click it on and off, and that's really handy because you might want to have a look at or preset your brush. This one is the reservoir, so this controls the paint. So I'm going to click here on load brush, and that's going to load this paint color here. But you can also click on this palette and go and choose a different color to use. So let's choose a sort of more red color. We'll also need to load the brush because right now the brush isn't loading automatically. So we're in effect using a clean brush, and unless we actually dip it in the paint pot, if you like, then it's not loading with paint. This is the dip in the paint pot icon. So this is loading the brush, and so this will load the brush every single time you make a brush stroke. And this is the clean the brush one, and so it's enabled so our brush is going to be cleaned right now automatically every stroke we make, so it's never going to get dirty. But if you paint like an artist, you'll probably want your brush to be dirty because that would happen if you put a paintbrush through existing wet paint. So you may want to disable that, and that allows you to work with what is in effect a dirty brush. Now you've got a whole series of presets here which control these settings here. You can select any one of them to get this sort of effect, a dry brush effect or a wet brush effect, but it also helps to understand what these settings are actually doing. The wet option is pretty important because you would probably think that that has to do with the paint on the brush, and it doesn't. It has to do with the paint already on the canvas. So if we set this to 100% wet, then this paint and this paint and this paint are wet. But because we've got sample all layers selected, this paint is wet too. And this is treated as paint. This is white paint. So right now we've got oodles of wet paint in front of us. And that's because this setting for wet is at 100%. Load is loading the brush. And if you load the brush with a very small value of paint, for example 1%, then eventually it's going to run out. Well, you hope it's going to run out because that may not be the case. I'm going to make this canvas very dry. So making wet 0 means I've got a dry canvas. So I'm about to put paint down. So when I put paint down, because I've only got a load of 1%, you would assume that this brush is going to run out of paint. Now, not all brushes run out of paint at the same rate. So let's go back here and let's find a different mixer brush. So I'm just going to select this one here. Let's just make sure it's a very small brush. So I'm just adjusting its size using the brush settings panel. We're on 0 wetness and I'm going to do a load of 1%. Now when I draw with this brush, you can see that it's running out of paint. In fact, it's totally run out of paint, and as much as I try and paint with it, it's not painting because we've also lost this reservoir setting. So let's go to load brush and let's make sure that we load paint after every time we make a brush stroke. And so this is a load of 1% on that brush at that brush size. But this was a 1% load on a different brush that behaves very, very differently. So you're going to need to experiment with these brushes to see if you want it to behave like this, whether it's even possible, and what sort of a load amount you want for your brush. Now, because I made all this paint dry, there's no option for mix, but if I make it all wet again, then we get some mix options. And mix can be anything between 0 and 100%. And we're going to start with 100%. And let me just make this brush a little bit bigger as we do that. So I've got a very small load on this brush. All the paint is wet and mix is 100%. Let's see what happens. But before we do that, let's just disable this airbrush option and let's enable sample all layers. So we're sampling the current paint layer, the paint layer below, which is white paint. We have a 1% load on our brush. Let's see what happens. Well, we're getting a really high mixing rate with the paint that's already on the artboard. And in some cases, you wouldn't even get paint laid down. All you would be doing would be pushing paint around the existing wet paint. Because setting mix to 100% means that most of the action is happening on the canvas, not on the brush. But if we take that back and make the mix 0%, then all the paint is going to come from the brush and very little is going to come from the canvas. You can see a little bit's been pushed around, but not a lot. And again, every brush is going to behave differently as to how much it responds to this mix value. And a mix value of about 50%, then we're going to be getting paint from the brush as well as paint from the canvas. But every single one of these brushes is going to behave slightly differently. Now, if you want to use an airbrush effect, you can. So we'll click on airbrush here. I'm going to set the flow to really, really low. I'm going to turn wet off, so I'm just going to treat it as if the canvas is dry, and let me just increase my brush size. So if I just click, I'm going to paint a single stroke. Now it's moving because of the brush preset settings. So let's just stop it from moving. We'll turn off the shape dynamics for a minute. So it's going to paint just like that. But if I press and hold, it's going to get darker and darker. So that's the airbrush effect. And we can control the initial amount by setting a flow value. And then as we continue to press on that brush, then it's going to get darker and darker, as if we're spraying the artboard with an airbrush. You can also have flow set to a low value and it still works even without the airbrush option, but it also works with the airbrush option. And you'll probably want to have a reasonable flow on your brushes so you get a fair amount of paint when you paint with them. Now, we talked earlier about dirty brushes, so let me just size this brush down, and I've got some sort of dirty paint in here. If I hold the Alt key on a PC, the Option key on a Mac, I can click on this to try and pick up this dirty color. Now, I haven't picked up the dirty color, I've just picked up a solid color. And the reason for this is that load solid colors only is enabled. So whatever I select over in terms of trying to load my brush with right now, I'm only going to get a solid color. But if I disable that and go back and do my Alt click, then I'm picking up a dirty brush stroke. And so now when I paint, it's with a dirty brush. And that dirty brush isn't going to disappear. This is going to be the reservoir from which I'm painting. So you can see that it's going to be possible to sample paint, either paint that you've already laid down or perhaps sample something from a photograph and use that to paint with. Of course, we're getting white in here because we've got a white layer underneath and because we've got sample all layers enabled. If I disable that and come and select the paint here, then I'm getting a paint stroke that has transparency around it, so it's going to paint again very differently because it's not bringing white with us. Having a white background is going to be a little bit confusing because these sample all layers tends to go on and off a bit depending on what brush you're using, and it can end up with you picking up white paint when you don't expect to be picking up white paint. So if we have a look at our drop down list now, we'll be able to select something like very wet, heavy mix paint. Let's go and load solid colors only, and let's go and pick up a paint color. So I'm going to pick up a sort of blue color. We're on a 50% load, so our brush is going to run out of paint at some stage, but let's have a look and see how it paints. Because we've got wet set to 100%, the underlying paint is very, very wet, and so we're picking it up as we move along. Now this brush is not being cleaned, and because it ended up in a dirty area in a mix of paint, we can expect it to start painting dirty all over again. But after a while, because we keep loading fresh paint into it, we're actually going to end up with fresh paint on the brush. Up until now, when we've been using the mixer brush, we've been looking for brushes that have this little mixer brush icon just immediately above them. And we haven't been able to use brushes like this one because as soon as we select on it, we lose all the mixer brush tools. But if I go back to a mixer brush and try and use one of these general brushes, I am actually able to use it because these don't have icons. They can be used as mixer brush brushes. But what if I want to use this dry media brush with the mixer brush? Well, as soon as I click on it, I lose my mixer brush options. So we can use it, but this is how you're going to do it. First of all, you need to find a mixer brush. So you get these mixer brush tools on the tool options bar, and then just exit that brush panel. Go to the brush settings, and here in the brush settings up the very top are those brushes that we saw in the brushes panel, and this is the one that I said I wanted to use but wasn't able to use. Now if I click on it, you'll see that it's added as a brush that we're using, but see how we've still got mixer brush settings. So for brushes that you can't select from this drop down list here, you can generally find them in this area of the brush settings panel, and when you select on them, they behave differently. So now we've got the brush that we wanted, and we can use that as a mixer brush. So it's going to have all the behaviors of a mixer brush. For example, we can take the load down to a very small value. Let's make it load with color every stroke. And if we drag far enough on that brush, it is going to peter out. So it is actually showing up a 1% load as being something that will eventually run out of paint. But you can see it's running out of paint a lot later than the brush over here did. It ran out of paint much earlier. This one's running out a lot later. So one of the things that you'll need to be aware of with the mixer brush is that different brushes work very differently, and so you'll really need to experiment with it to see what it's capable of doing. You may recall that I mentioned earlier that there are a couple of ways that you can paint with the mixer brush. You can use it to paint original paintings so that you're using it very much as you would a standard paintbrush, or you can use it to paint photos, and we're going to look at each of those applications very briefly. I've got a cupcake here. The line art is on the topmost layer. I've got a white background layer. I'm going to paint on this middle layer. I'm going to select a color to paint with, so I'm going to do the cherry on top here. So I'll select the sort of cherry color. And now I'll go and find an appropriate mixer brush. And for this, I'm going to use this fan brush. So I'll select on it and just click away. Now it's been preset as a blender, so it's not going to do much right now except just push pixels around, and that's not what we want to do. So I'm going to select here on load brush, and I'm also going to make sure that it only loads solid colors. Right now I just want to get some color down. So I'm going to click here so that I'm loading the brush, each brush stroke. Don't want to clean it, so I can just remove that. Now it doesn't really matter whether it's wet or dry canvas at the moment because I'm going to deselect sample all layers, and I don't have any paint there anyway to push around. So we can start by just sort of brushing paint in here. Now I'm using a mouse, and so I'm going to change some of the brush settings at this point. I'm going to brush tip shape. I'm going to reduce the number of bristles and make it less of a stiff brush. Also, because I'm using a mouse, I want the angle jitter to vary a little bit, and I'm going to take this to initial direction. So it's going to follow me around a little bit as I paint. So I'm just going to lay the initial load of color down. I'm not needing to cover this up entirely. I'll go and get another color to use because I want to make a lighter spot over here. So let's recheck everything here. We're adding color. The canvas is wet at the moment. I don't really want it wet, so I'm just going to make it really quite dry so that the color I'm putting on at this point will actually go on and it won't be sort of mixed in yet. So I've got that paint, and let's go and add some even lighter paint. Again, I'm just reducing the brush size each time using the open and close square bracket keys so that I can get the size paint area that I want. And let's go for some dark area here. Now at this point I might start making it just a little bit wet and see if I can get some color in. No, that's not working, so I'm just going to undo it. I'm going to leave it dry and get some darker color in here. Now let's zoom in. You could leave this as it is, but you could also at this point start blending your colors. And for this, if you want to blend things together, you're just going to make changes to the mixer brush settings. So in this case, we want it to be 100% wet. And we don't want much, if any, load at all. And if we set mix to 100%, then we're going to be pushing pixels around that are already on the canvas. This color is going to be pushed around. We want to make sure that sample all layers is not selected. We don't want to be sampling all layers. And we can also clean the brush and not load it. So that means that our brush right now has no paint on it at all, but it's going to act as a blender. So now when I start moving around in this area, I'm actually just pushing existing pixels around. So it's like sort of muddying the paint job, if you like. And so you can go through and sort of blend things together much as you would do if you were working with a paintbrush. You may want to decrease the flow a little bit, see if that helps to perhaps make it a little less intense of an effect. So that's a way of laying original paint down in an image and then pushing those pixels around once you've got the paint on the canvas to get the effect that you like. The second way of using the mixer brush is to do something like painting a photograph. So I've got a photograph open here. You can add a brand new layer to the image and paint on that layer, but you might find that there's a lag because you'll be using the sample all layers and Photoshop will be sampling data from this layer to paint on this layer. And if you find that your computer slows down a little bit, you may be better off actually making a duplicate of the background layer and just painting straight onto this layer, keeping this background image just in case you need detail from that at some later stage. This is the way I'm going to use it. So I'm going to target the mixer brush tool and let's find a different brush to use here. I'm going to use this one here. It's a blunt round blender, so I'll select on it to target it. But of course we need to set it up to do what we want to do with it. So I'm going to the brush settings here and it's a little bit lackluster right now. So I'm going to increase the number of bristles and their length. I'm going to reduce the stiffness so it's a little bit of a softer brush, and I can also adjust the size of it, but until we get it onto the canvas itself it's a little bit difficult to talk about size. So I'm just going to close that dialog down. Now let's look at the actual mixer brush settings. Well, we don't want to sample all layers because we want to use the paint from the layer that we've created, and we're just going to put all our painting onto this layer. I do want it to be 100% wet, so that's treating this canvas like a wet image so I can push the pixels around. In this case, I don't want to lay down any color, so I'm going to set this up more as a blender type painting effect. So I have no paint here, and I don't think I want to clean my brush either, so I'm going to leave it a dirty brush. In terms of load, it doesn't really matter because I'm not really loading the brush anyway, but I do want to mix, and I want to mix most of the background color here. So let's just increase the size of the brush using the open and close square bracket keys, in this case the close square bracket key, and let's do a brush stroke and see what happens. Well, we're getting some really nice brush strokes here, so I'm going to need to be painting in a sort of horizontal direction to follow this waterline. So I'm going to bring some color in from the right hand side of the image into the water, and in a minute I'm just going to push it all back again. So I'm getting these sort of painterly strokes in this area. Now you can clean the brush if you want to, so you could disable that icon up here, and so the brush is going to be clean each stroke. So you're pushing clean pixels, so you're not bringing any color in from the previous stroke. But it's just a case of picking up a style that suits you and a brush size obviously that suits you. I'm painting with an enormous brush right now because I just want you to see the effect. I'm not actually looking at completing a finished painting here, but I just want you to see that the brush strokes you can get. To make this brush paint a little bit less intensively, go back to your brush settings, and I'm going to decrease the number of bristles. So I want it to be a bit spikier. I'm thinking that it's a bit too intense right now. So now when I bring it in, it's painting a little bit more spiky. And again, I can reduce the flow if I don't want quite so much paint to be pushed around each time. So I'm getting a more subtle effect and able to sort of pull these pixels in to get a more interesting result. It's going to be easier with a tablet, but it's not impossible to get good results with a mouse. So that's how you might use a mixer brush on a photograph. But of course you can always pick up color and introduce color into this image as well. That's quite easily done by just selecting a color to paint with. Let's go for a sort of lighter yellow color. Let's fill our well. I'm going to fill it every stroke. I'm going to leave it dirty. I want the mix to be about 50-50. I don't want a very big load on this brush until I've sort of tested it out. And now we're able to introduce some color into the image. The color that we have here is now blending in with the colors in the photograph, and so we're able to sort of recolor the effect or add more variety of color than there was in the original photograph. And that's really part of what a painting is. It's paintings have more color, more rich color generally than photographs have, because they're photorealistic. Paintings are not. So I hope that helps you see how you might use the mixer brush in your own artwork in future. I hope that you've enjoyed learning these Photoshop techniques. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, I'm Helen Bradley for Design Cuts.